Thank you very much. And gentlemen, good afternoon. It's the morning here in California, and we're going to let you take over for the next hour.
All right, that sounds great. Thank you, Francis. Really looking forward to this. And obviously, as our day continues, a big one here with Race Industry Week. So we appreciate everyone who is signed on right now and tuned in. And our next panelist, we're going to talk about the UK and US collaboration Powers Major Series from 2022 with the Motorsport Industry Association. And as you can see, our panelists here, Chris Aylett, the CEO of MIA, Pat Simmons, Formula One's Chief Technical Officer, and Peter Digby, the Managing Director of Extract. So gentlemen, welcome. And Chris, let me just sort of turn it over to you to get things started here. I know we've got a lot that we're going to be covering here in the next hour or so.
Hi, Pat. Well, thank you very much for the handover, but you can stick your nose in and questions in whenever you like, because I know they're coming in thick and fast. I was enjoying watching those lots. I was enjoying Ross Brawn. So thanks for this. And thank you, Pat and Peter, for signing in and linking up with us. I know you've both had a pretty hectic day, and I don't know if either of you got a chance to look at any part of Ross, but I made a few notes and I've dug out some tricky questions for you, Pat.
Thank you very much. Well, Ross and I have actually been in the same meeting for the last few hours. He dropped out to talk to you, and now he's taken over and I've dropped out to talk to you. So we're talking 2026, so we've got a little bit of time to catch up.
Well, listen, guys, both of you have a fabulous track record, if you like, in motorsport. I mean, you, Pat, are 40 plus years in your area, and Peter started at Williams all those years ago. And I think it would be useful for the audience who, if you could just shorten that and just explain your background, your personal background. And of course, in your case, Pat, there is hardly a Formula One champion from Senna to Schumacher that you haven't at some time been the race engineer of. And I think people forget that your beginnings were definitely trackside and very much hands-on. And just touch on that and the role you currently play. Ross was very clear as to the link that you have with the Formula One. And Peter, I know you've come all that way from the Williams team. I think you were general manager of Williams Formula One all those years ago, and you helped set up Extract, and now it is this multi-million-dollar business, both here in the UK and also in the USA. So guys, just take the floor for a little while and try and let the audience know of your background, please.
Want to go first, Peter?
Yeah, I'll kick off first then. Yeah, in fact, well, it goes back to the late 70s when I started to work for Williams. I trained as an aircraft engineer, but I went to Williams and covered for Ross Brawn. He was a race mechanic, and I joined really to look after gearboxes. But within a month, Ross was leaving the team to look after his wife as she had their first daughter. So I kept one on the team for 3 or 4 races and covered for him. He never went back on the team, and I actually came off it because I wanted to carry on some studies. And as you mentioned, over the period of 6 years, I rose production controller, factory manager, and then left to go and join Ross and Adrian Newey in the same team. So that was pretty awesome, where we joined the Team Haas Formula One team for about 18 months with Teddy Mayer and Tyler Alexander, which was a great team. But of course, the sponsors withdrew and everyone went their way. And I went to join Mike Endine at Extract, who just set up the company. There were 4 of us when I joined, and I obviously brought along a lot of F1 contacts, and Mike had rallying, etc. So we just decided to get involved in doing very high quality gearboxes in much reduced lead times compared to what was around at that time, and very quickly rose to a position where we were supplying 9 of the current of that batch of Formula One teams. With many championships, and then the business grew from there into sports cars and touring cars. And thanks to Chris, I went to the States probably in about the mid-90s, I think, Chris, wasn't it? Late, about some time around then. And we went to Charlotte, and we went up to Indianapolis, and you showed me what was in America. We'd already supplied the Penske team and Lola and Reynard with lots of their product, but that was more remote. But once after that visit, we then started work in the States, and by 2003 opened our first office or facility in Indianapolis, and that grew. And when we opened that, by then we had already secured a one make contract to supply IndyCar, with one gearbox supplying the whole grid. And this was one of the sort of first steps of this one make product which is now spreading throughout motor racing. And I'd like to have a discussion with Pat about Formula One when we've later on in this conversation. But yeah, when we opened in Indianapolis, I think 100% of our business was IndyCar. Today it's probably 20%. So we've grown a lot of our business in the US into other sectors. We opened up in North Carolina in 2010. At that point, there was a bit of a shift. Firstly, you had the likes of Penske's and Ganassi starting to get involved in NASCAR. But also there were some other people moving from Indianapolis to North Carolina, and it looked like that was going to become the center of US motorsport. Well, in fact, I think you'd probably say Indianapolis and North Carolina are about equal now. So we've got a facility there. And now today we employ about just under 30 people in those two offices. They both just doubled in size. We've got about 12,000 square foot facilities in both places. And they both operate as a stores and engineering support. And particularly for NASCAR, which I'll come on to later in this conversation. But yeah, X-Track as a company, we employ 360 people now, turnover about $75 million. We export 70% of what we make from the UK, which we're very, very proud of. And X-Track for a long time was being at 100% employee owned. All the employees had a share ownership in the company. It's only just recently changed when we've had to substantially expand our investment and double our factory size and get involved in a lot more hybrid and electric vehicle products. But yeah, good fun. I get paid for hobby. I'll do it for nothing, as you would, Chris, I'm sure.
I think nothing is a different value to some folk, but yeah, nothing. Yeah, Pat, I mean, that's a pretty good story from Peter. Now, yours is even more colourful, I think.
I'm not sure about that.
From the early days, it certainly is, and the people that you've touched as in business as you go through. Over to you, Pat.
Yeah, well, I started off actually as I was lucky enough to be an undergraduate apprentice with Ford, and this was in the mid-70s. And anyone who knows the UK motor industry in the mid-70s would probably know that's not a great place to be. So when I graduated from Cranfield University, I decided I'd get involved with motor racing, and it was a 3-year project. It's lasted about 44 years now, but I'm getting the hang of it. And I started off designing cars in sort of lower formulas, Formula Ford, Ford 2000, Formula 3. And in 1981, I joined the Tolman Formula One team, which was just starting up then. In fact, I was employee number 20. We were quite small teams in those days. And I started putting together the wind tunnel programs and things like that, running R&D and race engineering. As I say, we were small. We had to be sort of multidisciplined engineers in those days. And through the years, I've remained in Formula One, working at Tolman, sort of morphed into Benetton, which morphed into Renault. I stayed with the team through those years. Seen the other end of the field, working for Marussia for a little while, and then went to Williams. Where we had a lot of success 2014, 15, 16. And then in 2017, I decided to sort of hop over the fence a little bit and go from being a competitor to getting involved with regulations. And what was behind that was, as many of you will know, Formula One had really been run by Bernie Eccleston for many, many years. He held the commercial rights. And he worked with the FIA, but really he ran the show. And when he or the venture capital people behind him sold out to Liberty Media, it was decided to set up a technical group within Formula One, because we wanted to really see how we could improve the racing. If we wanted to grow the sport, we wanted to understand what it was that attracted people, what it was that put people off, and really understand things. And the phrase that I continually use is to have evidence-based decision making. And I think for many, many years, there was a lot of shooting from the hip, and let's do this, let's do that, let's try wider cars, bigger cars, faster cars, slower cars, smaller cars. It went on and on and on. So I set up a group of engineers so that we could study mainly the design of the cars, but we do a lot more than that. And just to give you one sort of random example, we we actually measure the galvanic skin response of people who are watching races. So it's effectively like wiring up part of our audience to lie detectors. And so as they will go on and they'll sort of rate the race in a normal sort of way with a tablet, you know, every 5 minutes saying this, I'm enjoying this, I'm not enjoying it, etc. But we look behind that to get the real evidence behind it, take some of this sort of cognitive bias out of it and actually see what they are thinking. So very wide ranging what we're doing. We're looking at the cars, we're looking at the fans, and then another string to our bow really is that we also are now quite involved with circuit design. And tomorrow morning I'm off to Jeddah for the first Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, and really excited about that because with the demise of Vietnam before we actually got racing on it, it's the first circuit that we as Liberty Media, as the commercial rights holder, have been heavily involved in the design of the circuit. And we think that assuming it gets finished tonight, it will be quite spectacular.
Well, thank you, Pat, and thanks, Peter. I was just sitting here. I'm really delighted that Lynn St. James, Peter's congratulated on that growth. So I presume she's talking about your business growth. So, but it's lovely to hear from you, Lynn. And you were always a great host to us all when we were at Indy and elsewhere. So it shows this stretch of this or the reach of this kind of audience. I was pleased the Motorsport Industry Association, MIA, was set up 25 years ago, or over 25 years, and I've been running it pretty much most of those years. And both these young men, Peter and Pat, have known of that organization, and we have many friends over there in the States. And I just encourage you all, please get in touch with the MIA if you want any contacts in the UK with any of these guys, or you want to do any business, buying or selling, it doesn't matter. We're here to just help the industry. I'll just tell you that I raced my first car, a TVR Gran Turismo, when I was 18, and I won an egg cup. I seem to remember, and I raced for over 20 years, nearly 25 years, and I ended up running a race series around Europe, and I was then racing my Can-Am McLaren M8 8.4 litre, which I still dream about. That's just about as good as it gets in, as far as I'm concerned, in racing. A nice, safe, comfortable drive, that was. Anyway, so we're all three of us are mad keen on our racing careers, and mine lasted another 25 years or so because of the marvelous MIA. So I'm going to move on and ask you some questions. Peter, I just want to touch base with you in terms of your USA business, and how do you service the USA customers? Do you service at all the racetracks? Because there's a heck of a lot of series that you're now involved in, and presumably you can't service it all from parts depots. So how do you look after your customers from the UK to the USA and then out of the tracks?
Well, actually, we are pretty hands-on in the US. It is different model to us compared to the UK. I mean, the British touring cars, we support each an individual race, but there's so many races around Europe that we can't really support all of those other than the big ones like Le Mans. But when we get to the States, yeah, we are there in the paddock with a truck full of spares for a lot of the sports car races and a lot of the IndyCar races. And next year, unusually, the NASCAR model that we are introducing includes service. NASCAR is very, very special. There are a lot of cars, 40 cars or so, racing at about 40 tracks or more, or 40 races, I should say. But of course, I'm sure you know that each driver or each number, there are 7 different cars. With all the different circuits from short tracks to long tracks, to dirt races even. So it's really challenging. So we have to introduce this year, we're bringing out 3 different specifications of gearboxes. And of course, you've got races all over the world, all over the US. So a few days apart. And so you can't just have one truck driving around. So we've had to take on 10 extra guys to help service that operation. So yeah, we do operate, say we're based in North Carolina, based in Indianapolis. So a lot of people just come to our facilities there and buy spares and take them themselves, and they'll always have a spare gearbox amongst them. But NASCAR is very different, and we've got to supply 300 gearboxes before the first race. And this is, I touched on earlier, this this one make concept that's going around. So I think before we came along in NASCAR, there were 7 different gearbox suppliers, all doing tuning their own 4-speed H-pattern gearbox. Obviously, the cars are a lot more advanced now. The Dallara have helped design a car which now, from a gearbox point of view, has a 5-speed, and it's a sequential gearbox, but it's a transaxle as well. So it's much more demanding from a manufacturing point of view. But they last. The idea is they last a lot longer, and it's far more versatile as well. So yeah, we can accommodate all these different changes without the vast stock of parts that they used to have. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to cut down on the inventory and try and standardize the parts. And the phrase I heard was they want to stop the competitors from competing within the gearbox. So as you heard Ross say, and it was music to my ears, that he doesn't want people spending $500,000 on trying to improve the efficiency of a gearbox by 0.01%. And that is what these standard gearboxes are all about: getting the economies of scale, fixing the regulations so that they are more reliable, so they're not designed to break one lap after the end of the race, and making them a little bit more simple, but really large volumes of a fixed product that the teams cannot develop anymore. When we put a gearbox together, we'll put it into a test cell and sort out the oil levels and make sure that they're all built within very, very tight constraints. Because if you're supplying a whole grid of cars, you can't have some that are more efficient than others. So we have to come up with a very tight criteria for that gearboxes have to pass, so that all of them are exactly the same for each team. But then they fit them and forget them. Gearboxes never win races; they only lose them. That's the old saying. Engines win races, so we're just at the back. You're meant to forget about us. So, and that's the model that we've got in NASCAR. We've got it in Australian supercars. We've got it in IndyCar, and of course, under another word of homologation, we've got it in many, many hundreds of sports cars, which all race in GT3, where you almost have a fixed specification of gearbox and other parts, fixed specification of the car for 5 years or so. And again, it keeps the costs down and spreads that big engineering cost at the start over a large volume of parts.
Well, thanks, Peter. I have a feeling Pat might join in on that discussion, because one of the subjects that I don't know whether you listened into, Ross, but it leads really well into next year. He said, undoubtedly Pat will mention this, next year's changes that are going to take place anyway around the vehicle. He mentioned aerodynamic changes, 18-inch wheels, new tires, and a growth in controlled items that the fans won't see, but areas of competition has been improved. Can you just touch on that change that we're going to start to see next year in Formula One, Pat? Rather touched on by Peter, saying he agrees with elements of this for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I mean, of course, the major changes, the work we've done on aerodynamics and tyres, all of which are just about making the racing closer. But it's absolutely right what Ross said, and Peter has reiterated, that there are elements of the car that really, they can absorb a vast amount of money. They become minute performance differentiators. They are totally hidden to the public, and I really question why we do that. I think that since I joined Formula One and sort of went over to the other side effectively, I've been pleasantly surprised by the number of our fans who really do have a genuine technical interest. Not necessarily with a great deal of technical know-how always. So it's not just the engineers who have this interest. There are a lot of they are pretty avid fans, but they're not necessarily from a technical background, but they still have an interest in things. But nevertheless, there are an awful lot of parts on the car that are effectively hidden because the teams are very, very secretive about them. And the trouble is that these things tend to even out. And as we've been talking about gearboxes, there's a great example there that some years ago, we all almost simultaneously developed seamless shift gearboxes. And at the time we did it, they were worth about 0.3 of a second around a typical lap. And a seamless shift gearbox really, there is effectively no torque interruption as you shift up through the gears. Now, everyone's got them. They definitely cost more than a conventional gearbox. And there is no performance advantage left in them because everyone's got the same. And so, really, I question, why do we do it? And how many people know how they work? How many, if you said to even the relatively technical fans, do you think a twin barrel gearbox is better than a single barrel gearbox? You get a bit of a blank look. And so, yeah, there's a lot of case for standardizing. Of course, we've got a cost cap in Formula One now, which I think is one of the biggest steps forward that we've made in many, many years. But even so, there's no point in wasting money. Yes, you can say, well, the team should control themselves, but the trouble is that that's great in theory, but it doesn't necessarily lead to good racing. If one team has spent all their money and gone in the wrong direction, spent all their money on a seamless shift gearbox or something that's not really giving them much performance advantage, then all it does is split the field up. And we've been doing everything we can to get the field closer together. So I'm a fan of having more spec parts, but balancing it. And really, those parts that are very obvious, which in our case is largely the aerodynamics and things like that. Yeah, let's have some competition there. But there are other areas where either it's not particularly relevant or it's prohibitively expensive. And I would say an example of that is tires. I have a particular interest in tires. I think they're fascinating things, but much as I enjoyed the days when we were fighting between Michelin and Bridgestone, we had Goodyear in and all these sort of people, the fact is that was an incredibly expensive way to go racing. And it did actually destroy the racing sometimes, because if one of the tire manufacturers on a particular day had a big advantage, then you had almost a two-part field. So I'm quite happy with even something that is as big a performance contributor as the tires, with them being a single component, if you like. And yet, I will get technical directors in teams saying, no, we want to do our own gearbox. And I really do question why.
Hey, can I jump in and ask a question here? I'm curious about this because in my world, but I'm in the NASCAR world, that my office is here at Charlotte Motor Speedway. But when you start to talk about adding spec parts and doing this, on one hand, we hear a lot of the ownership saying, this is just costing us too much money. You have to find ways to save us money. Yet those same ownership people are doing things like spending 7 figures developing new pit guns just so they can have faster pit stops. And we go to something, that becomes now a spec pit gun with Paoli. But how do you find that balance? How do you manage the, hey, we want to let them have their own creativity in finding their speed, but we also really have to save them from themselves because that's what they're asking for, even though they're going to go back to the shop and try and spend as much as they can developing everything they can?
Well, I think the first answer to that, Brad, is the budget cap, because the budget cap is a great thing. It allows them a great deal of stupidity. So in other words, they can go off and spend it on the wrong thing. And you mentioned wheel guns. I mean, wow, the money we spend on pit equipment in Formula One would run a Formula 2 team for a year. The trouble is that when you allow that sort of freedom, you will get money spent in the wrong direction, and then you split up the field, and that's a shame. So you have to find this balance. And the real answer to your question is it's quite a difficult balance to find. It is a sport. We're looking for performance differentiation. We certainly don't want to reward incompetence or anything like that. But at the moment, or certainly up until this season, there has been far too much emphasis on performance comes from dollars. And I think that we are leveling that out. So we had this, we set ourselves several objectives in 2017 when Liberty took over. Yes, to get the cars racing closer together, but also we have about a 3% split between the front of the grid and the back of the grid in terms of performance. And we set ourselves a target of trying to halve that. And ways of doing that are to standardize some of the parts, think about what's difficult for the small teams, try and eliminate those. And in our aerodynamic work, we've had that in our minds as well. So it's not just about close following, it's about trying to make things a little bit easier. And believe it or not, the 18-inch wheels, which a lot of people think we've done that to sort of modernize the cars. Yes, it's good in that respect, but it also, because the tire is such a difficult thing to model aerodynamically, by having a stiffer sidewall, we actually make it a little bit easier for everyone. If we make it easier for everyone, that actually gives more of a leg up to the teams at the bottom of the grid than the top of the grid.
I think you're muted, Chris.
Yeah, sorry. I hope that helps, Brad. Peter, I'm going to dive into some of the questions that are coming in, and I'll do the same with you, Pat, because we've got an audience who are asking questions, not just me. So some easy ones, Peter, kind of not one word, but short answers. What will be the challenges to gearboxes and drive chains for electric cars?
As road cars, I guess, or is that motorsport? I guess for road cars, yeah.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, we're only involved in what we'd almost call R&D for the electric and hybrid market. Our speciality has been manufacturers coming to us with a whole number of different schemes and layouts and wanting to know very quickly, or having the parts very quickly, so they can go off and run their different layouts and see which one is best. For us, with an electric car, quite often it's noise. We've got to try and keep those gearboxes as quiet as they can, because that obviously noise is more noticeable when you've got electric, but also strength and inertia. We do a lot in Formula E, and there you're trying to make the gearbox as efficient as you possibly can, because they've obviously got very limited amount of power. And so yeah, we've had to come up with some pretty fancy gear teeth and fancy gear designs, but yeah, we'll you give us a challenge, we'll come up with the best way of doing it.
Thanks, Peter. Pat, do you at the FIA? Yeah, you're not the FIA. Do you see need for more crossover of race technology to production cars?
Yeah, I saw that question come up, and perhaps I should explain that I'm Formula One, not the FIA. Now, we work very closely together, but Formula One is the commercial rights holder, FIA is the regulator, and in the past, never the twain shall meet. We're trying to bring it closer together, but you need to be careful. It would be wrong for the commercial rights holder to be doing too much regulation. But do we need to be road relevant, I think, is really what we're talking about. And the answer is, I think we do. I prefer to call it society relevant, because I think that there are so many aspects of what we do in Formula One that have knock-ons way beyond the sort of automotive industry. I mean, I think everyone knows the favorite story of how Williams Formula One team, or the offshoot from Williams Formula One team, developed a new type of shelves for supermarket fridges that saved a huge amount of energy by applying the sort of aerodynamic knowledge that they gained in Formula One. So we do need to be society relevant. And of course, I hope at some point we're going to talk about sustainability, Chris, because that's our big push at the moment. It becomes difficult as the sort of light mobility sector moves more and more to electrification. The power densities that they're dealing with are just not suitable for a big racing car like a Formula One car, an Indy car, or anything like that. But there's still an awful lot that we can contribute, and the electric machines on a Formula One car, the battery technology, the power electronics, they are all absolutely state of the art. We have C ratings on our batteries, which is effectively, if you like, it's a way of thinking how fast you can charge a battery, that are way beyond anything on a road car. And a few years ago, I think we were all questioning how relevant is that. But of course, now everyone's saying, well, yes, we are worried about range, but we're actually more worried about charging the batteries quickly. So a lot of the technology we've developed, silicon carbide in the power electronics, some of the battery technology, certainly the battery management, we're really pushing towards the ability to charge very fast. So lots of things like that are relevant. And they must remain so.
Thanks, Pat. And Peter, an easy one for you is a seamless shift. This is Lawrence. Is a seamless shift gearbox similar to a dual clutch transmission?
Yes, there is. There are different ways of doing it, as Pat inferred. They use a twin barrel arrangement in Formula One with a single clutch, which is one way of doing it, but needs a very, very high pressure hydraulic system and a computer to run it. X-Track actually has a patented system where we actually have a single barrel as well for seamless shifts. So there's different ways of doing it, and we use that quite a lot in motorcycling. They're all pretty much the same thing.
Okay. Pat, here's an interesting one that I'm going to pick up just so that you can clarify. It's a very simple question, and think hard, because people want to know clearly. Is Formula One owned by Liberty Media, or are they getting it wrong? Now, what I know is that there is a 100-year license from FIA, as I understand it, but go for it, Pat, and try and explain easily.
Wow, you call that a simple question? I guess it depends what you mean by owned.
Exactly.
Liberty Media own the commercial rights to Formula One. So what does my company do? We put on the show, we negotiate with the promoters, we negotiate with the circuits, we negotiate with the sort of major sponsors, we bring the teams together. We work with the FIA, who are the regulator, to ensure, that we are, the budget cap, for example, originated within our organisation. But as I said, we can't write rules. That would be against sort of competition practice. So the FIA regulate things. We pay the FIA to perform that regulatory function. But we actually, I guess, run the show. One hopes makes the profit as well.
That's good. And it is I'm right in saying that the brand or something of Formula One is owned in quite a long contract with the FIA. Is that not right?
The commercial rights are, yes. There was a 100-year agreement signed some years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Well, let's move on, if we may, and touch on. I just noticed something else. I'll just say I've got. One of our friends asked that question, Don Taylor, and I just want to point out Don Taylor is the director of the MIA in the States, as is Jeremy Byrne. Both of them will be at the PRI show on the X-Track booth. So if you go into PRI and you want to talk international trade or international motorsport business, Peter is hosting the MIA directors, Don and Jeremy Byrne. So I just wanted to spot that and thank Don for one of those many questions. Now, let's talk about the future, Pat. I was going to say, where is F1 going? But let's focus on the sustainability question that came up and was handled by Ross and further discussions, because you're right at the heart of this sustainable future for Formula One. And I know you're proud of the progress you're making and excited by certain changes that are bound to come. So over to you, Pat, as a starter, and then we'll have your views, Peter, too.
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of our big things. And as I said earlier, in the middle of another call where we're talking about 2026 engines, and the 2026 engine will run on a fully sustainable fuel. Now, you might say, well, that's a long way away, but the fact is we're doing it properly. And we are not prepared to accept sort of greenwashing. We're not prepared to accept fuels that, on the basis of or on the surface they look as if they're a green fuel, but the reality is they're anything but. So we're putting a lot of effort into it, working with a lot of partners. We're doing a lot of testing, a lot of modeling at the moment, and sustainability is absolutely important to us. And I'm sure Ross probably shared with you our sort of strap line that no one should be ashamed of being a Formula One fan, and that is really, really important to us. And over the next few years, we need to take action to ensure that remains the case. And I can envisage a time when, for example, we're racing in the middle of somewhere like Singapore, and we're probably the only internal combustion engines that are in that city, because everything else will be electric. So we have to show that we're doing the right things. So we have a sustainable fuel program, a carbon neutral fuel program, and we're promoting the the competition there, because I don't want to get into too many technical details, but at the moment, what's very interesting and unusual about a Formula One engine is that we regulate the amount of fuel that goes into it, and then you add as much air as you need to make the thing run, which is totally opposite to the way we've designed racing engines forever and a day, which has always been to get as much air into them as possible and then add the fuel that's required. Now that in that sort of switching things over, we've actually promoted a lot of efficiency, and we're very, very proud of the fact that our Formula One engines are running at 52% thermal efficiency, whereas a regular road car is sort of in the low 30s. So we're very proud of what we've done at the moment, but we also want to now really cut our carbon footprint at the moment, well, entirely. We have a carbon footprint of about 250,000 tons CO2 equivalent right now, and 0.7% of that actually comes from the cars. But nevertheless, if we go to a carbon neutral fuel, while it won't make a huge impact on our footprint, we feel it will demonstrate to the world that, you know, there is a way of running internal combustion engines with much, much lower emissions. And actually, it's not just CO2, because we're synthesizing the fuel, we can take all the bad things out that, you know, happen to be the remains of dinosaurs or whatever, you know, that we have to put up with. So we can make very, very clean fuels. And yeah, I think we're going to get very good results from it. And yes, there will be other formulae who will go to their so-called sustainable fuels before us. And in fact, as Liberty Media, we actually own Formula 2 and Formula 3 as well. And we will be pushing the fuels into Formula 2 and Formula 3 before Formula 1, partly because it's a slightly easier problem, partly because we need less of the fuel. And one of the problems right now is there's just not enough product around, but we're really pushing on that. And then on the electrical side, we're very keen. I'm sure everyone knows that there are some questionable materials in electric vehicles, the cobalts, the nickels, the rare earths, things like that. So we're really investigating that and trying to get a real cradle to grave view of where all these things are, both in their carbon footprint and the sort of moral sustainability, if you like. So we really are trying to look at these, and we want to. I think that the day someone really stands up and criticizes us, or we have, you know, some sort of demonstration on the starting grid from Extinction Rebellion or something like that, the day that happens, it's too late. We've missed the boat. We have to preempt it. We have to make ourselves sustainable. We have to make sure that people know about it and they're proud of what we're doing.
I'll tell you what, before I move to you, Peter, I'm going to ask Brad whether anything that I notice you nodding enthusiastically at what Pat was saying. Do you think, how close are NASCAR to sitting back and looking at what they're doing in Formula One and saying, it's not, let's change overnight, but the direction of travel of Formula One, have they got it right, perhaps, Brad?
You know, the interesting thing to me from my seat, and we're actually going to have NASCAR on Friday here at Race Industry Week as well, which would be good, but is, you know, for the longest time, NASCAR resisted a lot of some newer technology things. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot that got developed in the race cars that was very technical and very advanced for what it was. But now we're going to this new car for the first time, independent rear suspension, the gearbox versus transmission, a lot of different things that have never been in a NASCAR stock car before. They've also resisted a lot of electronics, and I know there's a question about that as well. You know, at one point when traction control and some things were starting to come into play in different racing series, they literally took the ignition box and mounted it up on the dash, so it was out of reach from the driver or anybody else. And they've managed things that way. And when you look at how high tech some of the elements are on open wheel cars, Formula One, IndyCar, whatever it might be, all the things that are on the cars as you see them going around the track, NASCAR resisted putting those on the race cars at any time during a race weekend. Now, they were here testing at Charlotte Motor Speedway 2 weeks ago, and you see all kinds of antennas and lights and different things coming off of the cars. They don't do those things on race weekends, but the electronics they have in there now, and they talk about the SMT technology where they can read a lot of the data coming off of the race cars and the telemetry and everything. A lot of that is a pretty closed system as well. And I don't know exactly how they're managing it with the new car and, you know, week in and week out. But for example, a lot of things when they come into play with NASCAR, aren't things that the teams are carrying to the racetrack with them. They're things that are being handed out to them on a given race weekend, just to have some of that control of what they're doing. But I do think from a technology standpoint, and especially with this next gen car coming out next year, that absolutely they've looked to a lot of different racing series. I mean, if someone's familiar with an Australian V8 supercar, they're going to look at the next gen car and see a lot of familiarity, but a lot of the things that we're talking about here, you know, gearboxes and all of that, are starting to come into play. So it's really nice to see them embracing the technology, you know, but again, they're pretty strict and cautious, if you will, about anything that might come into play that someone is going to be able to sneak something in there that, you know, is something new to the sport. But I think they do a fairly good job of trying to manage that parity.
Thanks, Brad. Now, Peter, you've sat quietly for a while. You've got various thoughts on, first of all, you've increased your activity with NASCAR substantially. So you could comment on the latest NASCAR car, but then you've overheard what you saw Pat doing with Formula One, and you know that very well. So perhaps you could give a perspective, your own view on what might happen with NASCAR in the years ahead, and whether Formula One are on a road to success or ruin.
I think it was a great shame in Formula One that they didn't sing the praises of how efficient the engine was before Liberty came along. There were some massive gains there and hybrid packages, etc. that the spectators didn't really know about. All they could hear was that the things were a lot quieter than they had been before, when they loved all the screaming V8s and V10s. So I think Formula One nowadays is far more attuned to what it's got to be. And I agree with the way it's going. I think the sad thing is that we're probably being pushed too far by our politicians, too fast, I should say, by our politicians to go down the EV route. And I felt personally that there was a bit more time in the hybrid. We just had a big influx of very efficient 3-cylinder internal combustion engines that were hitting road cars, and suddenly they're out of date and they're all having to be replaced by electric vehicles. I think, Chris, you're a great one for saying politicians are voted in for 5 years, so you know they don't have to worry about what's going to be down the line. And when everyone was talking about the EV vehicles being around in 2040, then they were going, no, let's make it 2030, 2035. No, let's make it 2030. And I'm just not sure that the infrastructure, for sure, in the UK especially, is just not up with it. And we are going to see big problems with supplying that amount of power to all these charges, etc. Within motorsport, we are doing quite a lot of hybrid packages. Actually, we've done the British touring car one that races next year, but our biggest program, which we're very proud of, is a collaboration between X-Track and Bosch and Williams to introduce hybrid packages to the ACO and IMSA, the LMDH series. And I would, there's other series that are looking at similar sorts of packages. I'm a little bit worried that, you know, Pat used the word greenwashing. There might be a little bit of that because it is just a small part of the total power of the car. But I think it's in some cases it's used as a push to pass. It would have been nice to see that pit stops could only take place under electric power. I think a few people have looked at that, but we're not there yet. So I think that program is great, and I would be very surprised if NASCAR are not looking very closely at that for the future, because they really have opened their eyes up to new technology and introducing that to the formula. So I would be we would certainly expect that, and we have designed that gearbox so that at any point in time it could have a hybrid package on it, or something else that people always consider is a paddle shift system, which some are not in favor of. They like to see the drivers fighting a manual gear lever, as they do in Australia with great effect, Australian supercars. So yeah, we've always, that gearbox that's in NASCAR is incredibly flexible, and whatever we're asked to do, we can do with it. Yeah, it's I think Pat's got it right, and I'm excited to see how Formula One goes, because it is the flagship for our industry. You know, what goes on in there does trickle down. Paddle shift gearboxes started in Formula One, and now in most other formulas, they're what everybody uses. And so, as there are many other examples as well. So I watch with interest.
Thanks, Peter. In actual fact, that slogan I came up with, remember that the life of a battery is now longer than the life of a politician in our governance. And when I said it a few years ago, I wasn't absolutely sure. Now I'm absolutely certain that it applies. But I don't quite know what we do with that. Pat, I'm just going to throw out some of these questions because I want to. Can you measure emissions on a Formula One car? And if you can, why don't you? They congratulate thermal efficiency. How will the loss of the MGU-H impact the PU efficiency numbers? Nice, easy ones, Pat.
I think that was from Don, wasn't it, about the emissions? Yeah, and yeah, you've touched a nerve there, because I really think we should be measuring emissions. Now that's quite a difficult thing to do. And we've actually just done a series of single cylinder tests where we were trying to do it unsuccessfully, but we have got some more tests going. But I think that what we would like to do is we would like to sort of try and push the engine manufacturers into a realm where the emissions are lower. Now, you can imagine with the sort of efficiency we got with our engines, we're very, very clean burning, so there's not much in the way of particulates. We're tackling CO2 with the sustainable fuels, but NOx is a problem, particularly when you run slightly lean like we do. So yeah, it does become a problem, and you need to get even leaner if you really want to get rid of the NOx or get the combustion a bit cooler. So there's still a lot to do. Actually measuring it is difficult. After treating it is difficult. So yeah, we're not there yet, but things we need to do. And I can't remember the last question, Chris, was
how will the loss of the MGU-H impact the PU efficiency?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting thing, because when we started looking at the 2026 engine, we had two things in mind. Do we really push the efficiency even further? And I set a target of getting up to 60% thermal efficiency. And the only way, of course, we could do that is if we did co-optimization of the fuel and engine together. So if we're going to synthesize fuels, why do they have to be like gasoline? They don't have to. They could be something much more, I hesitate to use the word exotic, but something, that pushes some of the boundaries of regular gasoline forward. So we could have done that. But in actual fact, as we sort of debated it, we realized that one of the things we needed to do is we needed to bring the cost of these engines down. The cheapest engine out there is way over $1 million. The most expensive is double that. So, they are expensive. We wanted to bring that price down. And the MGU-H has been a great thing for hitting these very high efficiencies. But what's a little bit unusual about a Formula One engine is it's at its most efficient at wide open throttle, full power. And most road engines, of course, that's not the case. They get their best specific fuel consumption at somewhere a little bit below best torque, for example. So the MGU-H was certainly helping us to our really good numbers, but wasn't terribly relevant. Now, I did once have this sort of dream about an 18-wheeler truck, I think you'd call it in America, a big semi, with perhaps a 1 litre 4-cylinder engine running flat chat in it, and with very efficient combustion and everything, effectively a little Formula One engine in there. And yeah, that would be great, because you would be running it at really high output all the time. And then something like an MGU-H is worthwhile, because you're putting a lot of enthalpy into the exhaust, so you can recover it. But for everyday use, it's actually not that relevant an item. So we decided that what we would do in 26 is we would get a bit more road relevant. So we've taken that off. It will drop our efficiency, as will our fuel, because we're going to bring the fuel much more into what's termed a drop-in fuel. In other words, a fuel that is more suitable for road cars than the fuel we've got at the moment. And we in 2026 we won't be hitting the sort of mid 50% efficiencies, but we will have something that will be very transferable onto light vehicles.
Thanks, Pat. I've got quite a few simple little questions, and these are quick answers to you guys. Otherwise, I'm trying to satisfy as many people as I can. Somebody's asked this, Peter: how did Extract finally succeed in off-road racing after a tough start some years ago? And does Extract make gearboxes or gear sets for USA Saturday night races or drag races? Go for it, Peter.
No, we don't do for the sort of Saturday night racing. We have had to specialize now in these larger contracts. So many of our design, we've got 80 guys in design. And so they take up a lot of time when we have to do a program like NASCAR. So we've tended, sadly, to move away from our roots, which were actually in rallycross. And so we concentrate on these other big programs. Sorry, Chris, what was the first question?
Off-road race, as you mentioned, rallycross.
Yeah, we're really proud of that. Yeah, we've just come first and second in Baja. So that was a great result.
Now, wait a minute, Peter. That's not happened straight away. For goodness sake, be honest.
No, we've been there for a long time. I mean, in fact, X-Track started in rallying, world rallying, and still have a big presence in that with Toyota and Skoda. I'm going to be honest and say I think we were probably caught out a little bit about how much demand there was, or how much the stresses and the loads on these things. But these cars have got 3 foot of wheel movement, if you're used to designing the sort of stuff that Pat's contemporaries want, which is all a little bit twee and light, maybe we were just a little bit too looking at the numbers without really looking at the reality. And I know when I went to Australia to do the supercar spec for their new gearbox, I went to the Gold Coast and I could not believe how high the cars were taking off and landing over the curbs. And I just came back and said, I don't care what you say in the FEA finite element analysis department, we're going to make bigger gears, because these boys they're throwing it around and bouncing off the tyre walls is all part of their strategy. And so we had a little bit of that in the US, I'm sure. But yeah, we're really proud of where we are now. And I think the SCORE Championship is starting to really stretch my knowledge of stuff over there, but we're doing very well in that as well.
I take some pride as being the madman who took them, Brad, out into the desert to try and find the customers. And all I said was, the prices you charge, Peter, just aim for the biggest motorhome, and they'll be able to buy an X-Track transmission. Anyway, that's enough.
I love the fact that if you want to set up a booth there, you do it alongside the Scuderian queue. So all the cars at Scuderian, you're there trying to sell to them as they go into Scuderian. It's great.
Pat, here's a question for you. The strictness of FIA tech inspections and parts replacements in Formula One, Hamilton's DRS measurement, Red Bull wings, etc. Is this a sign of a governing body overreach, or is it a necessary evil in a complex sport?
Okay, yeah, I'm afraid the answer is both. It is a complex sport, it's a big money sport, and therefore, a limit is a limit. However, I think there's a huge difference between intent and accident. And, if something has gone wrong and you're slightly out of the limits, certainly in the past, in the days of the late Charlie Whiting, there were many times when he took me aside and said, look, I don't think this is quite right, just get it fixed for the next race. And that was everyone appreciated that approach, and you respected it, and you damn well did get it right for the next race, because you knew you were in big trouble if you didn't. I would like to see a little bit more of that. It's a personal opinion. It's not the opinion necessarily of the FIA or Formula One, but a limit's a limit. And these guys are so competitive, and I say these guys, I'm not me, of course. But give them an inch and they'll take a mile, to use
Here's an interesting question. Pat's always been interested in education of young engineers. How and where will be the best place for them to start? And this particular writer says, I studied at the MIA School of Race Engineering, which is an online program we've been running for many years. A lot of American guys go to that. So it's interesting that online education using the top class race engineers to educate the next session is entertaining. But then finally, I can ask you both this, Peter and Pat, is there still a creative opportunity today for engineers in motorsport with so many design restrictions and the limited adjustment on the next gen NASCAR car? Is there still a challenge there for future engineers? Peter, you have a go, then Brad, then Pat.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. X-Trac's really proud of our apprenticeship and graduate engineering programs. And if you look at Formula One, Pat will vouch, there's so many races now, so demanding. that a lot of these engineers, probably following COVID as well, are thinking, do I really want to travel around the world to 23 races at my age or whatever age they're at? And so we need some young engineering blood in there. And that's going to be really, really important. I think the problem within Formula One teams, when Pat and I were both involved in them, you did actually learn to design the whole car. And I think that's the challenge nowadays, that it's really, really hard for these engineers to get a handle on the whole car as well. That's why I'm sure the Adrian Newers of this world are still incredibly busy, because they come from that era. But there's undoubtedly a massive demand for young engineers.
Thanks, Pat. Brad, I was talking about the creative juices of engineers, and is it being stifled?
In some ways, but I do think that, especially at least the direction NASCAR is going, with so many spec parts and everyone literally having the same race cars, parts and pieces and all of that, you're not finding a half a second or a tenth of a second anymore. You might be finding a hundredth or a thousandth of a second. And I think that's where engineering truly comes into play. Plus, with very limited track time and 15 minutes of practice on a given race weekend, you're going to need to figure out a whole lot more in the computer than you are on the racetrack.
And
I
finally,
think just joining in on that, Chris, in Formula One, we support all the STEM subjects. We sponsor Formula One in schools, which is a worldwide competition. I'm an alumnus of Cranfield University, and I'm a visiting professor there, and I lecture to the motorsport students there, and indeed in other universities. So we certainly support the education side. And in terms of innovation, you just look in different places. Some of the things in the last few years, of my sort of competitive career that we innovated on, they're not public knowledge, but wow, they were innovative. They really were.
Well, thanks, guys. And I'm going to pass back to Francis in a minute, but I would like you all just to say, are we heading for a positive, innovative future, or have we got a problem ahead of us? Pat?
Positive.
Peter?
Yeah, I'll go positive, absolutely.
And Brad?
I would concur, positive in a big way.
Yeah, well, I must admit,
well, Chris, if you want an answer, if I may say this, we have been, we are basically humbled and thrilled by all the participation and endorsement we have received this week. And that's a really good indication of a bright future. And when you see the lineup of people we have had in the last 2 days, or yesterday and this morning, and we have another 3.5 days to go with Zach Brown following the next session, that's really an indication how strong our industry is. And so thank you all very, very much. I am very privileged to have had the opportunity to meet both Pat and Peter many times over the years. And of course, our dear friend, Chris Ellett, who put an awesome panel.
The concept for EPARTRADE is basically, in my opinion, there's a big hole in the internet. So the internet started many years ago, but there's never been an online business community for racers on the World Wide Web. The need for EPARTRADE is actually quite obvious. Basically, people in the business of auto racing need a place online to hang out and to get their problems solved.
It's extremely simple for a buyer or for a supplier to interact on the platform. The first thing you need to do is sign in, which is free. And the second thing is, when you see a product that you're interested in, all you need to do is click on request more information. If it's a company, you click on request more information, and then from there, it is forwarded directly to the buyer or to the supplier.
You can go to epartrade.com, you become part of a community of businesses in racing, and it makes sourcing products much easier than just on the internet or using Google.
At EPARTRADE, there is no e-commerce. It's literally a connection just like at a trade show. So now, any time of the year, a buyer could reach out to a supplier through an email.
More than that, it's a place to go just to keep current every day. So it's a good place to start your workday in your racing business or in your offices of your professional race team. And you know you're current when it comes to new technology, industry news, technical papers, technical videos, all of that and more. We're not looking for a million hits per day. All we want is people who are really the volume buyers of racing products in the racing industry to be part of the little world of EPARTRADE. We have racing businesses participating from around the world. So you get suppliers from around the world, you get buyers from around the world.
EPARTRADE really eliminates having to travel, closing down your shop. Now you have a place to showcase globally your racing product and technology.
There are two types of people, racers and everyone else. Racer Magazine is for those who believe that racing is a way of life. Racer embodies the excellence that defines a sport driven by passion, courage, and ingenuity. Get 1 year of both Racer's print and digital edition for only $39 with instant access to our entire digital issue archive. Subscribe now at info.racer.com.